I would like to call upon Professor Swaran Singh, a very dear friend and a colleague at IDSA when I started out on my career on these particular issues, and I learned so much from him as a senior colleague. He's currently the chairperson of the Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament, School of International Studies, my alma mater as well for my PhD at JNU, and very fond memories of the time that we've spent together. So I asked Professor Swaran Singh to look at the Non-Proliferation Treaty. You know, as Mark just mentioned, the treaty review conference is likely to be postponed to next year. It was supposed to happen last year to mark 50 years of the NPT. And it was supposed to be a big deal that we have the NPT for 50 years. And, you know, it was going to be a stock check on what the treaty was all about. Now, this will probably happen next year, thanks to the pandemic and the struggle that all of us have been in. Professor Swaran, if you could give us a sense of what do you think are going to be the challenges at the NPT RevCon whenever it takes place. We all have grown up understanding that the NPT stands on three legs. Where do you see the state of those three legs? Which one is the most wobbly, you think? And what should we be looking out for when we are looking at the forthcoming RevCon? So over to you.
Thank you, Manpreet. I'm delighted to be part of this excellent panel. Thank you to Pramod and his NIICE Nepal team. Let me first pinpoint the good news. I think until 1919, the Treaty of Versailles, disarmament was understood in human history as a victor disarming the vanquished. And it is in 1930s particularly that the debate came alive that that kind of disarmament had not worked, and therefore equal, mutual and voluntary disarmament phase started, which goes right away up to 1940s. 1960s onwards, we moved from disarmament to arms control, and we see the peak in the decade of 1970s when we have détente, and of course East and West begin to work together to achieve arms control, and from there we have moved to non-proliferation, which again can be linked as far back as to Kennedy era, but then we have even moved to counter-proliferation from there. So in that sense, a certain momentum has happened, the way title says, disarmament, arms control and non-proliferation. Second good news is that perhaps the fact that way back in 1962-63, President Kennedy had warned the world that by 1975 we might end up having as many as 20 plus nuclear weapon states, that this whole effort at NPT, which today defines the very central axis of non-proliferation order, began to be negotiated. And as Manpreet just mentioned, it had three pillars which it was supposed to work upon. Non-proliferation being the most important first one, the technical support and availability of civil nuclear technologies to know those countries who decide not to become nuclear weapon states, and of course finally disarmament, which meant for the P5, for the permanent 5 or nuclear 5 states would in their own good faith work on disarmament. So this is how it was conceived, and I think one can notice clearly the first thing that not 20, even today the 5 NPT nuclear weapon states plus the 4 nuclear weapon states which are not defined as per NPT definition, 9 states, not 20 states that were supposed to come up by 1975. Of course, there are many suspect states which are still in conversation. Also in 1980s, for example, early 1980s, about 70,000 plus nuclear warheads in the world have been reduced since then to about 14,000, which is an enormous reduction. Not necessarily NPT has done it, it's bilateral largely between Soviet Union, Russia and the United States, but NPT has created that whole ambience of a whole lot of conventions, agreements, agencies, norms and taboos, which perhaps facilitated that enormous 1/5 reduction. Of course, even today about 12,500 of these warheads continue to be between 2 states of Russia and United States. So the enormous reduction is something which is significant to underline, and NPT does need to be credited for that very clear. And NPT, which was on its 25th anniversary in 1995, was extended indefinitely and unconditionally. is seen by several nations as a universal law treaty, and it has a 50th anniversary. And as was said by Mark, it became 50 years in March 2020, and April of last year was supposed to be RevCon, which has been postponed to January this year, then to August this year, and maybe again to January next year. That also may be a good news in itself, because just remember, if it was to happen in January of 2020 when President Trump was in command, and his nuclear posture review had clearly expanded the role of nuclear weapons, including several other threats, including large conventional attacks, or even the tactical nuclear weapons, or even cyber attacks. So that perhaps is the good news that this got postponed in that sense. Let me very quickly underline the 2 or 3 challenges that RevCon, as and when it meets, will have. Everyone knows challenge will be clearly the aspirant JCPOA controlled Iran, which of course is also signatory to IAEA and additional protocol and other things. But you have now Ibrahim Raisi coming to power there. And I think that is going to perhaps change the ambience of how negotiations happen in Vienna. 5 rounds have happened. One notices the reluctance of a certain level of European partners who in 2015 had been much more excited. And second challenge clearly is North Korea, which for 15 years has built up its own missiles and nuclear stockpiles, and it is a clearly nuclear weapon state. This kind of who will bring first is a continuous story between United States, since again President Donald Trump withdrew in 2018 and so from the Iran nuclear deal, and now of course again 2 summits with Kim Jong-un had failed in February of 2018, and again certain amount of hope that some negotiations might begin again. But I think last point I want to underline is this, including disaffection and divide between non-nuclear weapon states and nuclear weapon states. And in January, when the prohibition of nuclear weapons treaty was finally came into force, that divide has become much more stronger, and I think nuclear NPT RevCon will have to deal with that divide, which has become very, very powerful divide now between non-nuclear weapon states and nuclear weapon states, which are opposed to this total ban on nuclear weapons. In fact, they are even saying that nuclear weapon states are saying that TNW, this treaty, TPNW, actually undermines NPT. So they are proposing it as a contradiction. Second fundamental contradiction that need to be underlined is how over time NGOs and civil society has taken over global disarmament, arms control, non-proliferation. The last treaty signed by states in the conventional mechanism, which is Conference on Disarmament, was 1993 Chemical Weapons Convention. Since then, starting with the anti-personnel mine ban all the way to this current treaty of TPNW, it is NGOs and civil society which has taken the initiatives and taken lead in that direction. That really redefines the whole gamut of how disarmament, arms control and non-proliferation will be understood, and how gradually the powerful states will be, sort of domesticated by power of the public opinion, and how much effort that will take. So in that sense, NPT, which stands at the center of this non-proliferation order, is getting marginalized as other forces and their initiatives begin to take much greater center space in how the nuclear non-proliferation order will be defined in coming times. I look forward to any comments and questions, but I better stop there right now. Back to Manpreet.
Thank you very much, Swaran. Again, an excellent expose on what the NPT means in today's times, what the challenges are, and what we can expect whenever the review conference takes place. We'll have something to tell us more about where you think the posture review could be taking us. But Swaran, can I come back to you and get you to comment on a little bit more on the NPT metric of success or failure?
Thank you, Manpreet. 6 minutes was a really short time for a professor who usually takes 40 minutes to make his first point. But let me now say something on the success of NPT, which I described to be the very center of non-proliferation order. And in that sense, it has been fairly successful in containing the proliferation, definitely the horizontal proliferation. and to some extent also vertical proliferation. I think the difficulty lies in other two pillars, where dispersal of civilian technologies, the promise that was handed out to non-nuclear states, that has not been affected. In fact, increasingly, proliferation has encouraged initiatives in denying those technologies to non-nuclear weapon states. And likewise, the third pillar of, in good faith, the nuclear five nations will pursue disarmament. All arms control that has happened is only between the two big sheriffs, Moscow and Washington DC. Only once I remember, perhaps in 2008 or sometime, President Obama had initiated a P5 meeting on the subject of exploring disarmament. So, in case they have to really build up the trust of the larger community of non-nuclear weapon states in NPT, which is dissipating, as I just mentioned very clearly, because of the TPNW now becoming a reality and showcasing that gulf. I think the N5 must begin to talk about disarmament, collective multilateral disarmament among the P5. And of course, there are countries like China that always will say that until 90% of their arsenals are removed, we will not be even negotiating on these issues. But that is where I think that reinforcement of trust in NPT needs to be brought about. Like I mentioned, in last 20-25 years, it is the NGO, civil society, now laureates, retired foreign ministers and others who have become a force unto themselves in molding norm and narratives of disarmament and arms control. How they can also be, obtaining a greater space and voice in RevCon meetings of NPT and other possibilities of providing them space in that sense. And then I think the final point to me is, let me put my neck out and say, it is in best interest of the United States today to delegitimize nuclear weapons. You remember the whole debate of four horses had started some time ago, but it has dissipated because, again, the role of nuclear weapons was expanded during the Trump era. But it is in the best interest of United States, because you notice, if a small country like North Korea develops nuclear weapons, then you see President Donald Trump, who hates traveling, coming twice all the way to Asia to talk to Kim Jong-un and fall in love with him, as he said. And that compulsion is underlining how, if we continue to treat nuclear weapons as currency of power, the United States becomes extremely weak and vulnerable state, and is not able to use, because taboo, I think another success of NPT is this enormous Norman taboo, non-possession, non-use taboo, which is built, and I think it's universal today, is where the need for delegitimizing nuclear weapons is very significant. It's in national interest of United States to lead that campaign, because relatively launching unconventional wars or conventional wars is relatively the kind of norm today. You see United States going out and creating mess wherever they go, of course, but at least showcasing that prowess, even if they create a bigger mess than what was before they entered a particular theater. One after another, after Second World War, look at any intervention of United States, it's a mess. But that's a good mess, because it serves domestic constituencies in United States. It definitely serves their military-industrial complex that supplies weapons to both the terrorists and armed forces to keep fighting between themselves. That perhaps will be a better boost to American economy, even however crudely we look at it, to delegitimize nuclear weapons. And that perhaps would help us make NPT finally universal. You heard recently Imran Khan saying, if Kashmir is resolved, then he doesn't see any role for nuclear weapons. So a country like Pakistan is possibly contemplating, that nuclear weapons can perhaps be eliminated potentially. So I think that is how we can revert back from counter-proliferation back to non-proliferation, back to arms control, and go back to original goal of general and complete disarmament, at least in case of nuclear weapons. So NPT perhaps then go down the history in that sense as a universal norm. But until that is achieved, you will continuously have very important nations like Israel, North Korea, India, Pakistan, and other aspirant nations which will continue to stay out of NPT, and NPT will never be able to accommodate them. So in that sense, I think the key lies today that the United States should take a lead of co-opting civil society, of delegitimizing nuclear weapons and eliminating them, and of course making sure that somehow they are able to take non-nuclear weapon states into confidence by agreeing to the TPNW and also initiating a general multilateral disarmament negotiations at the level of N5 in UN Security Council. So there is a lot that NPT has achieved, but I think it is eroding its shine over a period of time, and the centrality of the narrative is moving somewhere else. And if an NPT has to be secured and protected to go down in history as having played a central role in nuclear non-proliferation, I think these kind of initiatives will have to come upon, and obviously the hope lies that United States will take that initiative, because even if we keep presenting Rajiv Gandhi action plans in UN General Assembly, they are good for domestic constituencies. They make no difference at international narrative. So only when the United States will take some serious bold initiatives, maybe something can happen. So NPT needs to be rescued at this stage, otherwise it is going to fall off the cliff. Manpreet.
Thank you very much, Swaran. Again, Swaran, sorry to just give you a minute, but we are left with only 2 minutes now.
Thank you, Manpreet. Let me very quickly try. The question from Dr. Upadhyay was about the 50 years of NPT. I believe it's been a substantial success, at least in horizontal proliferation containment, not in disarmament and not in exchange of civilian technologies to non-nuclear weapon states. What I am concerned particularly is how rapidly NPT is losing its shine, and therefore people talk about midlife crisis of NPT. So in that sense, it needs to be perhaps revived and protected is what I'm underlining. To the second question, I was delighted to see that my friend Hahua spoke before me, and I can easily now stand at variance from what she said. The statement of P5 becoming a possibility as to whether nuclear war cannot be won and should not be fought. Long back, Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan in early 1980s had jointly signed that statement already. So I don't see problem between United States and Russia today. Neither I see a problem with China, which has been also promoting NFU as a possibility. I think bigger problem in signing such a statement will come from France and Britain, and that has to be underlined. European countries, including Germany particularly, are particularly drifting away from the consensus building. And I think equally easy would be not just a joint statement on nuclear weapons, nuclear war cannot be won and should not be fought, but ideas like NFU can be on the table, which can also build consensus that maybe all states, they have done moratorium several times. Why not a joint statement on a subject like this? Or delegitimizing, which I underline is much more required today, but which P5 should stand up and initiate some kind of disarmament initiatives, even for the lip service sake, because that is the crisis today, the crisis of trust that non-nuclear weapon states do not have anymore in N5. Thank you, Manpreet.
Thank you, Swaran.